coded but bifurcated stream of money promises or threatens, and here the equivocation is deliberate, to destroy the social armature that suppresses desire. Deleuze and Guattari redefine surplus value on this basis. Capital constitutes a surplus value of flows insofar as it conjoins the flows of credit money and payment money, such that surplus is no longer defined by the fixed quantitative difference between the value of labor power and the value it creates, but by the changing qualitative difference between mutable quantities of credit money and mutable quantities of payment money. Thus, the value form is dissolved into qualitatively quantified flows. The surplus value of flow, then, is the intensive difference between two series of varying magnitudes, credit money and exchange money, as opposed to the extensive difference between fixed magnitudes of money and labor. And this is why capital is then defined as a pure quality of the flow of credit money conjoined with a pure quality of the flow of payment money. Most importantly, it is because this qualitative conjunction tends towards the dissolution of all existing social codes that it harbors the potential to decouple desire from its subordination to the objects, subjects, alliances, and obligations that have defined human existence so far. And thus, the ultimate horizon for the liberation of desire is not communism, but schizophrenia, which is to say, the dissociation of producers rather than their free association, and the dissolution of social relations rather than their transformation. And in this regard, it's worth mentioning that the word communism only occurs once in Anti Oedipus, when Deleuze and Guattari are, recapitulating Marx's 5 stages of production in the German ideology, from primitive communism to socialism. And the word socialism occurs 11 times, often prefixed by the word state or accompanied by party. But the context makes it clear that it is always to be understood as a corollary of rather than an alternative to capitalism. What is noteworthy from the outset is the fact that this idiosyncratic but unabashedly metaphysical characterization of capital should be credited with a radical or even revolutionary critical potency, superseding all previous syntheses of Marx and Freud. Now, Deleuze and Guattari's denaturalization of desire and their desegregation of the social and libidinal dimensions are rightly lauded. Capital's shaping of desire, as well as its shaping by desire, is no longer decried as pathological, but gauged in its revolutionary as well as repressive consequences. But what Deleuze and Guattari mean by revolution is so far removed from what Marx understands by the term as to constitute a homonymy. Revolution in Anti Oedipus is no longer the liberation of human desire from the yoke of capital, but the liberation of desire from the yoke of human sociality. What is puzzling then is that a work that dismisses most, if not all, of Marx's fundamental commitments to the primacy of social relations, the definition of capital as a separation of producers from the means of production, the equation of surplus value with exploitation, the necessity of class struggle, a work that dispenses with all of these should be so widely perceived as renewing Marx. And as Isabelle Garot has observed, part of this is due to the fact that Anti Oedipus proceeds covertly, pretending to praise Marx while effectively burying him. And this was noted at the time of the book's publication in an enthusiastic review by one of its early champions, Jean-François Lyotard, who wrote, "Contrary to all expectations, or precisely because the sensational title is an illusory effect, what the book subverts most profoundly is what it does not critique, Marxism." Why then does this subversion masquerade as fidelity? Deleuze and Guattari attribute the ascendance of capital to the decline of the state. The state arrests and fixes the flows that have escaped territorial coding by overcoding these flows. And where the territorial coding of the earth proceeded by marking, voicing, and seeing, without separating these actions from what is marked, voiced, or seen, the despotic overcoding of the state proceeds by signifying, subjectifying, and objectifying everything marked, voiced, or seen, thereby instituting a transcendent separation between signifier and signified, subject and object, and sensible earth and intelligible heaven. And this separation marks a transition from savage nomadism to sedentary barbarism. Capital's dismantling of the state proceeds through the privatization of property and the internalization of the creditor-debtor relation, with the former determining the latter. Now, the claim that privatization is the condition of generalized commodity production and that through privatization class begins its dissociation from caste are both recognizably Marxist. But the consequences that Deleuze and Guattari draw from them are not. Imperial caste, on their account, is defined by the extrinsic difference between dominating barbarians and dominated savages, and by the exteriority of dominating creditor to dominated debtor. As it dismantles the state and privatizes the proprietor-property relation, capitalism transplants the dominating creditor, dominating debtor relation into the subjectivity of the private proprietor. What was an external split is internalized. Dominant societal law is internalized by the dominated private self, forging the civilized social subject, which desires its own repression. And this is why Deleuze and Guattari maintain, and this time contra Marx, that whereas pre-capitalist societies allow for a plurality of castes, capitalism allows only one class, the bourgeoisie, as the class that has interiorized domination and that desires its own repression. So, quote, as they put it, to reread history through the class struggle is to read it in terms of the bourgeoisie as the decoding and decoded class. It is the only class as such, inasmuch as it leads the struggle against codes and merges with the generalized decoding of flows. End quote. Thus, the ascendance of private property, commodities, class, and capital signifies a general breakdown of territorial and despotic codes, spearheaded by the bourgeoisie. The state is made to serve the new class relation, integrating relations of wealth and poverty between owners of the means of production and owners of labor power, while reconciling exchange money with credit money. And because there is only one class, according to Deleuze and Guattari, the bourgeoisie, there is no external opposition between capitalists and proletarians, only an internal opposition between the desire to produce and the desire to consume. And this subjective internalization of the class relation reduces the opposition between labor and capital to an opposition between monetary flows of exchange and credit, thereby preparing their eventual commensuration. What allows the integration of these initially disparate monetary flows is the subordination of alliance or merchant capital to filiative or industrial capital. And Deleuze and Guattari quote Marx to describe filiative capital's ability to generate itself from itself. Quote, capital becomes filiative when money begets money, or value a surplus value, value in process, money in process, and as such capital, value suddenly presents itself as an independent substance endowed with a motion of its own, in which money and commodities are mere forms which it assumes and casts off in turn. Nay, more. Instead of simply representing the relations of commodities, it enters now so to say, into relations with itself. It differentiates itself as original value from itself as surplus value, as the Father differentiates himself qua the Son, yet both are one and of one age. For only by the surplus value of £10 does the £100 originally advanced become capital. So this is Deleuze and Guattari citing Marx in the first chapter of Capital, the transformation of money into capital. But what is striking here is that while for Marx, capital's ability to generate itself from itself, as if it were an independent substance endowed with a life of its own, is an objective appearance, it is the way in which capital presents itself to social consciousness, it becomes a productive essence for Deleuze and Guattari. On their account, filiative capital's ability to convert value into surplus value or money into capital does not require the exploitation of labor power. The latter is now simply a mutable monetary quantity, variable capital. And indeed, what Deleuze and Guattari describe as machinic surplus value is simply constant capital's ability to generate surplus value independently of labor by increasing productivity through automation, thereby guaranteeing an automatic reflux of payment money towards credit money. Quote, so as they put it, hence there is a machinic surplus value produced by constant capital, which develops along with automation and productivity and which cannot be explained by factors that counteract the falling tendency, the increasing intensity of the exploitation of human labor, the diminution of the price of the elements of constant capital, etc. Since, on the contrary, these factors depend on it. End quote. So, on Deleuze and Guattari's account, it is investment money that creates wages money, eliminating value so that the price of labor correlates directly with the price of goods. The discrepancy between the value of labor power and the value of its products disappears. There is no exploitation, merely the constant recalibration of the congenital imbalance between flows of debit and credit. These are not recognizably Marxian claims. But how do Deleuze and Guattari arrive at them? And why do they try to pass them off as Marxian in spirit, if not in letter? The two economists Deleuze and Guattari draw upon in their account of the interaction between credit money and payment money are Suzanne de Brunhoff and Bernard Schmidt. While de Brunhoff was a Marxist, Schmidt was the founder of so-called quantum macroeconomics. Definitely not a Marxist. The tension between their respective accounts is set out in an important article by Christian Kerslake. For de Brunhoff, the domain of credit money lies in the closed circuit of flux and reflux to and from individuals, whereas the domain of payment money lies in the open circuit flowing from individuals to commodities, to individuals to commodities, etc. While credit money is socialized in an indirect or mediated manner through the production or trading of goods, payment money is socialized immediately through exchange. So, in order for money to function as general equivalent, its convertibility into any commodity whatsoever depends on the convertibility between these two kinds of money, credit money and payment money. But this conversion requires specific conditions. Thus, de Brunhoff concludes, this displaces the referent for the value of money. It no longer has a base fixed directly by social labor and becomes lost in what she calls a permanent movement of confrontation and modification of equivalences. Nevertheless, de Brunhoff remains a Marxist, that money no longer has a base fixed directly by social labor does not entail that it is wholly independent of social labor. What fixes the monetary base over and above social labor is the political alliance between banks and the state. The composition of value is determined by this alliance as well as by social labor. And thus, class antagonism is displaced and subdivided. From the opposition between social labor and capital to the opposition between social labor and capital as maintained by the alliance between banks and the state. Quote, as de Brunhoff puts it, only in this centralized banking system can the different kinds of money become homogeneous and appear as the components of an articulated whole, end quote. And consequently, as Kerslake puts it, quote, for de Brunhoff, the question of the value of money becomes subordinated to the question of how the combination of the two forms of money is effected. The combination is politically negotiated between banks and states. But for de Brunhoff, the duality cannot be reabsorbed because it corresponds to the nature of money as a specific social relation, dissimulating the relations of production and reproduction of capital. And since money is intrinsically dissimulatory on her account, the two forms must dissimulate themselves and their relation to each other. Ultimately, monetary duality dissimulates the class division between capitalists and wage laborers, as well as the exploitation required to convert money into capital. Exploitation for de Brunhoff remains the extraction of surplus labor from necessary labor. However, in his 1971 seminar on Anti Oedipus, Deleuze seems to follow de Brunhoff when he insists that this convertibility between credit money and payment money is completely fictitious, that's his expression, insofar as it is designed to dissimulate the capitalist operation, what he calls a capitalist operation. Yet he also insists that this dissimulation is operational or organizational rather than ideological in nature. Quote, this is Deleuze, the capitalist monetary circuit can only function on the basis of an objective concealment which comes down to the convertibility of one form of money into another. However, as Kerslake points out, de Brunhoff does not describe the convertibility between credit money and payment money as fictitious, precisely because it is objectively necessary for the functioning of the capitalist system. It may be materially precarious, but it is not fictitious. Quote, convertibility is a logical implication of the general equivalent in an economy that combines metal or exchange money and credit. Whether the levers of monetary policy are sufficient to actualize it at any given moment is a distinct issue. So Deleuze takes the de facto failures of convertibility between these two forms of money for a de jure impossibility. But convertibility is still required to dissimulate the class relation and exploitation. It is a political imperative serving the interests of filiative capital. Failures to commensurate different credit monies are compensated for by reducing payment money. And the explanatory value of de Brunhoff's Marxist account lies in pointing, as Kerslake puts it, to an underlying cause of the crisis, dematerialized speculative bubbles, as well as to the specific character of the mechanisms used by the state to control the crisis. And by virtue of her Marxist position, to provide ways of interpreting the manner in which the expansion of the money supply is a way of protecting capitalism. It becomes easier to understand how austerity for the poor, for workers, students, the disabled, and the young is the inevitable consequence of the mechanism of quantitative easing, which exists primarily to support financial capital and to provide a cushion for enterprises no longer willing to risk investing in production. End quote. Consequently, as Kerslake observes, it is puzzling to see Deleuze insist that de Brunhoff's Marxian account is perfectly compatible with Bernard Schmidt's neo-capitalist account of money as pure banking debt. This is an account according to which, quote, the flux generated by the banks as a whole is seen as being compensated by a reflux that is channeled through production and the payment of wages as a whole, end quote. The two forms of money in Schmidt's account are metallic stock or payment and fiduciary payment or credit. Schmidt shows how the process of flux and reflux takes hold by focusing on the logic of bank deposits. A certificate of deposit is issued in return for deposited metal. Both metal and certificate can be reserved, lent, or spent. Four possibilities then ensue. One, both the deposited metal and the certificate are reserved. Two, the deposited metal is reserved and the certificate is spent. Three, the deposited metal is lent and the certificate reserved. Or four, the deposited metal is lent and the certificate spent. The fourth possibility represents a kind of miracle wherein, to quote Schmidt, money acts in two directions at once. Metallic, it exercises its power of exchange to the profit of the borrower. Fiduciary, it keeps the same power in the service of the depositor. The same money is effective twice over, since the actor and his double play at the same time, end quote. In other words, money is created by being simultaneously lent and spent. Quote, and this is Kerslake's very kind of helpful gloss on Schmidt's account. Quote, there is no prior fund that is then loaned, and banks no longer have a merely mediating function, but rather a creative one. The deposit is of a different nature, which Schmidt calls initial. In the latter case, one must speak of creation rather than multiplication, and of creation strictly speaking, that is, creation ex nihilo. Banks engage in two activities of creation by initial deposit and of mediation when it transmits a strict deposit. These two roles are distinct, and one can go further. They are separated at every point. Schmidt's claim then is that with modern money, the fourth possibility functions as the norm. The bank is simultaneously creditor and debtor to the productive economy. The ratio of reserves it holds is calculated in reference to this double movement of credit flux and debit reflux. In other words, money creation is built a priori into the logic of banking. And moreover, this is not just creation, but creation ex nihilo, quote, and this is Kerslake quoting Schmidt, the lending of previously inexistent money. This is exactly the definition of a true creation, ex nihilo. Instead of transmitting a previously existing money, the banks simultaneously induce a negative money, a debt inscribed on their own liabilities, and a positive money, a claim of the productive economy on the banks, end quote. So money is not twofold, but split into two flows, negative debt and positive credit. In effect, this means that payment money charges credit money. Quote, and this quoting Kerslake again. Thus, Schmidt's schema is as follows. The bank creates money and puts enterprises into credit. The enterprises then charge the money by transforming it into wages with a purchasing power calibrated to the range of currently produced goods. And finally, by selling products to the workers, the enterprises generate a reflux of money to the bank and somehow at the end of the circuit yield profits for themselves. So the circuit goes from money to wages to profits. The creation of money by banks replaces the creation of value by labor. Workers, despite being responsible for the whole product, are to be conceived merely as middlemen in the relation of credit and debt between banks and enterprises. And thus it is Schmidt that Deleuze and Guattari cite when they ironically rehearse the cynic's rejection of the moral reference in Marx's account of exploitation. And this is Deleuze and Guattari now from Anti Oedipus. Who steals? Certainly not the finance capitalist as a representative of the great instantaneous creative flow, which is not even a possession and has no purchasing power. Who is robbed? Certainly not the worker, who is not even bought, since the reflux or salary distribution creates the purchasing power instead of presupposing it. Who would be capable of stealing? Certainly not the industrial capitalist as a representative of the afflux of profit, since profits do not flow in the reflux, but side by side with, deviating from rather than penalizing the flow that creates incomes. End quote. Now, the mordant irony in this passage is deliberately equivocal. Are Deleuze and Guattari siding with the cynic, mocking him, or siding with him by pretending to mock him? And here, Kerslake's insistence that Deleuze and Guattari's vantage in this passage is, quote, clearly Marxist, seems to miss the redoubling of irony at work here. Since, on Deleuze and Guattari's view, capitalism is cynicism, their irony towards it cannot simply reaffirm the Marxian moral reference mocked by the capitalist cynic without also collapsing into cynicism. Nothing in the surrounding text, which I just quoted, indicates an unironic endorsement of Marx's theory of exploitation. On the contrary, the claim that human exploitation is now subordinated to machinic surplus value generated by automation points to its decentering. Surplus value, say Deleuze and Guattari, quote, cannot be defined by the difference between the value of labor capacity and the value created by labor capacity, but by the incommensurability between two flows of money. End quote. Now, certainly, Deleuze and Guattari speak regularly and apparently disapprovingly of capitalist exploitation throughout Anti Oedipus. But as we've seen, there is nothing in their theory of capital as surplus value of monetary flows to substantiate it. Profits, on their account, is created through the flux and reflux of money, not by extracting surplus labor from necessary labor. And moreover, when Deleuze and Guattari praise Schmidt for what they quote, the incomparable advantage of offering a delirious interpretation of an unequivocally delirious economic system, at least he goes all the way, and when they laud the, quote, profoundly schizo character of his economic schema, their point seems to be that schizoid delirium, the affirmation of opposing viewpoints through disjunctive synthesis, is the properly molecular alternative to the molar opposition between moralism and cynicism. Capital is neither good, as its naive enthusiasts believe, nor bad, as its moralizing critics believe, nor good because it is bad, as the cynic pretends to believe. Rather, for Deleuze and Guattari, capital renders belief and unbelief equivalent, and this is its challenge to straightforward irony, which wants to express disapproval by feigning disapproval, or vice versa. Thus, capitalist cynicism cannot be countered by simple irony, since by Deleuze and Guattari's own lights, the moral reference required for the unironic condemnation of exploitation has evaporated, as is indicated by their unironic sympathy for Maurice Clavel's overtly anti-Marxist question about alienation. Who is robbed, they say, is the serious implied question that implies Clavel's who is alienated. And this is why Deleuze and Guattari are rehearsing rather than avowing irony towards capitalist cynicism in the passage above. Since their own account renders exploitation incidental rather than essential to capitalism, they adopt an ironic stance towards a now antiquated irony, which does not realize that its moral referent has lapsed. This is a second order irony, an ironic stance towards the possibility of direct irony, which would still be ideological. Ideology is no longer relevant because capital is fueled by desire, not belief. And it is precisely the flow of money that channels desire. As they put it, it is at the level of flows, the monetary flows included, and not at the level of ideology, that the integration of desire is achieved. End quote. Thus, Deleuze and Guattari's second order irony disavows disavowal. It is neither approving nor disapproving, but schizoid. It affirms the equivalence or indifference between the belief that capital is exploitative and the belief that it is not exploitative. But capital is precisely what is beyond belief on their account. Now, what separates Marx from Deleuze and Guattari is his wholly unironic belief in the possibility of human freedom beyond capital, a belief which is unpalatable for Deleuze and Guattari's Nietzschean sensibilities. Of course, Marx also mocks moralizing critics of capital, but this is because he was the first to see that capital is cynicism, using law and compassion as alibis for violence and cruelty. But when Marx ironizes about capital's apologists who try to sanitize it while it stands caked in blood and filth, his irony does not entirely disavow the moral referent. It merely exposes its contradictoriness, the inconsistency between the ideals of equality and freedom proclaimed by capital's apologists and the reality of inequality and unfreedom upon which it depends. It is this appeal to contradiction that Deleuze and Guattari emphatically reject. Quote, as they put it, in truth, there are never contradictions apparent or real, but only degrees of humor. Yet who can afford to laugh at capital? Certainly not the proletariat, which is perhaps why Deleuze and Guattari insist that capital knows only one class, the bourgeoisie. Quote, it is the only class as such, inasmuch as it leads the struggle against codes and merges with a generalized decoding of flows. Thus, when Deleuze and Guattari ask who steals, they are disavowing the disavowal of cynicism, which would be a case of first order irony, to imply through misdirection a set of claims they are under no obligation to endorse. Capital is not a social relation. The capitalist neither owns anything nor exploits anyone. She is merely a representative of the instantaneous creative flow. The worker is not compelled to sell her labor power since this is created by her salarial purchasing power. And lastly, the capitalist does not steal profits since she is merely a representative of its creative afflux generated by the banks. More fundamentally, for Deleuze and Guattari, money does not represent capital, which for Marx is a social relation. Rather, capital represents the asocial relation between two kinds of money. Money is not a general equivalent or measure of value, but the conjunction of fluctuating debt and fluctuating credit. It is the flux of credit charged by the reflux of debit. Where de Brunhoff points to the alliance of interest between banks and states required to ensure the convertibility of credits and payments and to dissimulate the class relation underlying their divergence, Schmidt sees in this convertibility the sign of money's miraculous power to create itself ex nihilo from the flux and reflux of credit and debt. And thus it is Schmidt and not de Brunhoff that Deleuze and Guattari follow when they describe the convertibility between the two forms of money as fictitious. And what they mean is that it is objectively incalculable rather than politically negotiated. Quote, measuring the two orders of magnitude, credit money and payment money, in terms of the same analytical unit is a pure fiction, a cosmic swindle, as if one were to measure intergalactic or intra-atomic distances in meters and centimeters. There is no common measure between the value of the enterprises and that of the labor capacity of wage earners. This is why the falling tendency of the rate of profit has no conclusion. A quotient of differentials is indeed calculable if it is a matter of the limit of variation of the production flows from the viewpoint of a full output. But it is not calculable if it is a matter of the production flow and the labor flow on which surplus value of flow depends. End quote. Thus, on their account, the limit is incalculable because it is not the limit of variation between two quantities, the value of labor power in exchange and the value created by its consumption, but rather the fluctuation of credit or constant capital in relation to the fluctuation of debt or variable capital. Um, uh, and quote, this is Deleuze and Guattari again. So this is the differential relation, dy dx, where dy derives from labor power and constitutes the fluctuation of variable capital, or delta y delta x rather, where delta y derives from labor power and constitutes the fluctuation of variable capital, where delta x derives from capital itself and constitutes the fluctuation of constant capital. The differential relation expresses the fundamentalist capitalist phenomenon of the transformation of the surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux. End quote. Now, we've seen, or rather, the surplus value of code in Anti Oedipus arises from the asymmetrical conjunction of coded flows, and specifically from the productive imbalance resulting from the conjunction of filiative credit and alliance debt. Capital as surplus value of flow arises from the asymmetrical conjunction of decoded flows, and specifically from the productive imbalance between fluctuating credit money and fluctuating debit money. And thus, the money created by capital is no longer of the order of quantity, it is rather the quality generated by the difference between ceaselessly fluctuating quantities. But the fluctuation must be maintained because it generates the movement whereby the inscription of a fictitious credit is converted into an equally fictitious debit upon this credit. And this convertibility is not so much fictitious as ad hoc, the momentary result of extraneous intervention by banks and states, rather than an imminent result of the process itself. Thus, capital becomes a moving limit, perpetually deferring and displacing the definitive conversion of credit money into payment money, since their equivalence would effectively arrest the movement and crash the economy. Quote, so as Deleuze and Guattari put it, thus, the difference is not cancelled in the relationship that constitutes it as a difference in nature. The tendency has no end. It has no exterior limit that it could reach or even approximate. The tendency's only limit is internal, and it is continually going beyond it. But by displacing this limit, i.e., by displacing this limit between credit money and payment money, that is, by reconstituting it, by rediscovering it as an internal limit to be surpassed again by means of a displacement. End quote. Now, the claim that capital is propelled by the opposition between its internal bound, the incalculable conversion or decoding as process, and its external limits, the achieved conversion or decoded flows, echoes Marx's definition of capital as a moving contradiction between its means the unrestricted development of production, and its ends, the restriction of valorization to existing capital. However, Deleuze and Guattari transform the terms and the consequences of this contradiction. For Marx, the contradiction is manifest in capital's need to maximize surplus labor while minimizing necessary labor. Capital posits growing surplus labor as the condition for reproducing necessary labor, which is the minimum labor required to keep the laborer alive. Exploitation necessarily tends towards the suffocation of living labor. And this is why its abolition is ultimately a matter of life or death for the proletariat. But capital as displaced limit of convertibility between the flows of credit and payment money is bounded by their impossible commensuration. The capitalist socialist exists by staving off this commensuration. And it does this through what Deleuze and Guattari called axiomatization. Where flows of money are concerned, the axiomatic is effectuated by banks, corporations, and states negotiating a momentary conversion of the two forms of money. And thus, axiomatization displaces the limit, the conversion of credit and debit money, by facilitating the absorption of surplus value of flow or profits outside the spheres of consumption and investment. Besides banking, its principal modes are advertising, civil government, militarism, and imperialism. Thus, the capitalist axiomatic replaces territorial coding and despotic overcoding as the mode of anti-production proper to decoding. Territorial coding suppresses decoded flows, but in doing so generates a surplus value of code whose suppression requires overcoding by the states. In dismantling state overcoding, capital unleashes a generalized decoding which threatens the immediate fusion or conversion of the flows of credit and debit upon whose differentiation it depends. Thus, the capitalist axiomatic, principally in the form of the banking system, maintains the difference between the two flows of money, even as capital lives off the perpetually deferred vanishing of this difference. And it is the axiomatization of flows that prevents them from dissolving and preserves the socius, a society, capitalist society, as the human casing surrounding capital's propulsive decoding. Abolishing the axiomatic releases the flows and hence desire from the fetters of social production, which in the case of capital means the Oedipalization of desire, such that it desires its own suppression. But what propels decoding is the flux and reflux of money, so that ultimately it is the flow of money that holds the key to the liberation of desire, for Deleuze and Guattari. Quote, doubtless, Marxists will remind us that the formation of money as a specific relation within capitalism depends on the mode of production that makes the economy a monetary economy. The fact remains that the apparent objective movement of capital, by tending towards the fictitious convertibility of credit and debt, which is by no means a failure to recognize or an illusion of consciousness, shows that the productive essence of capitalism can itself function only in this necessarily monetary or commodity form that controls it, and whose flows and relations between flows contain the secret of the investment of desire. It is at the level of flows, the monetary flows included, and not at the level of ideology, that the integration of desire is achieved. End quote. What is the link between the secret investments of desire and capital's apparent objective movement as flux and reflux of money? Now, for Marx, the apparent objective movement is the objective inversion whereby capital presents itself as unique source of wealth. It does this by occluding its real productive essence, which is labor, or more precisely, the exploitation of labor power. For Marx, self-creating money is an objective inversion transplanted in place of capital's true productive essence. It is a fetish or reified form of capital in which money yields capital without the intercession of labor power. M is converted into M prime without C, without the intervention of labor power. Now, this inversion, first sketched by Marx in the metaphor of the camera obscura in the German ideology, consists in capital assuming the status of an automatic subject, generating itself from itself and reducing labor to the status of an inert object, dead labor. Through this inversion, capital as a social relation is naturalized. Social forms of production are identified with the simple material existence of their conditions independently of their social forms. And thus all labor becomes wage labor as useful productive activity, and the material means of labor, whether land or produced instruments of production, present themselves as capital in and for themselves. But to say that they present themselves as capital in and for themselves is to emphasize that the inversion is not due to subjective confusion or misperception. It is socially necessary, an objective illusion produced in and by capital's own movement. Capital necessarily misrepresents itself in and through the consciousness of those who generate it. Now, Deleuze and Guattari reject Marx's hylomorphic account of social form and material content, but their hylozoic alternative, in which representational inversion, Marx's camera obscura, is replaced by libidinal involution, Oedipus is self-suppressing desire, and flows of money are moral expressions of molecular desire, also turns capital into a self-sufficient quasi-cause. Quote, this is Deleuze and Guattari, capital falls back on all production, constituting a surface over which the forces and agents of production are distributed, thereby appropriating for itself all surplus production and arrogating to itself both the whole and the parts of the process, which now seem to emanate from it as a quasi-cause. As with Marx, this too is an objectively necessary rather than empirically arbitrary illusion. Quote, it is not a delirium of consciousness, or rather false consciousness, is true consciousness of a false movement, a true perception of an apparent objective movement, end quote. Now, here it sounds like Deleuze and Guattari agree with Marx when he declares all forms of society are subject to this distortion or inversion insofar as they involve commodity production and monetary circulation. But what did Deleuze and Guattari mean when they say that false consciousness is true consciousness of a false movement? What is the false movement here? Deleuze and Guattari reject the claim that labor is the substance of capital. So in what sense is capital's self-begetting movement false? Now, to answer this, we have to reconsider Deleuze and Guattari's account of representation. Representation first arises upon the territorial socius with the uncoded filiative flow as desire's repressed representative. Alliance then is the repressing representation, and incest is the forbidden junction of filiation and alliance as the displaced represented. While the germinal flow is the repressed limit of the socius, the decoded, decoded, deterritorialized flow, Oedipus is the displacement of this limit, its passage into the interior of the socius. Each figure of social production reconfigures these three terms, and with it the relation between decoded flows as the repressed or absolute limit of the socius, and Oedipus as its displaced representative or relative limit. At each stage, Oedipus changes place in the triangle of representation, from displaced represented to repressing representation to representative of desire. And thus, the history of civilization is the history of the Oedipalization of desire. But representation projects its own features onto the represented. Desire is disfigured by the features of the law whose prohibition represents it. The law of territorial coding is the conjunction of extended filiation and lateral alliance. It is representation as territorialization. The law of state overcoding is the conjunction of direct filiation, the god emperor, and exogenous alliance, imperial conquest via the despotic signifier. And this is representation as deterritorialization. And finally, the law of capitalist decoding is the conjunction of deterritorialized flows of credit and payment money through the axiomatic of corporations, banks, and states. This is representation as re-territorialization. If decoded flows are the absolute limit of social representation, capital as re-territorializing decoding is their relative limit. Thus, capital stands to what Deleuze and Guattari call the burning living center of matter, the body without organs, as a single qualitative commensuration through money to the non-denumerability of incommensurable qualities or pure intensities. Money as sheer quantitative equivalence is the relative limit of sociality, first warded off by surplus value of code, then by the despotic overcoding of the signifier, and finally embodied in capital's surplus value of flow, whose axiomatization wards off the threat of absolute decoding. Oedipalization proceeds through each of these three stages. It is at once the replacement of repressive social production by the repressing family and the projection of the familial triangle, mummy, daddy, me, onto libido in the form of incestuous desire. And this is how the relation of the family to the drives is substituted for the relation of social to desiring production. And moreover, it is Oedipus that gives rise to believing instead of producing and to representing instead of desiring. And thus, Oedipus explains how there can be a true representation or consciousness of a false movement, that is, of capital's self-generation. Oedipal representation, which is to say the molar fixation of desire onto persons, objects, and signifiers, channels desire through the flux and reflux of money and fuels its investment in the self, the family, work, nation, race, etc. As Deleuze and Guattari put it, representation no longer relates to a distinct object, but to productive activity itself. But a productive activity exclusively cordoned off within the confines of the capitalist axiomatic, which ensures that surplus value or profit is always reabsorbed by advertising, civil government, militarism, imperialism, etc. Thus, it is not greed or the pursuit of profit that really motivates the capitalist, but her libidinal investment in the non-convertible, non-appropriable flow of money. And in this regard, capitalist desire is a kind of asceticism. It's an investment or desire for what Schmidt calls non-possession and non-wealth. And this is why capitalist desire is secretly a desire for scarcity, not abundance, and for the inhibition of production rather than its expansion. This is the true perception of the false movement. It's also the crux of Deleuze and Guattari's critique of capital, i.e., capital releases desire in one dimension through the decoding of overcoded flows, while suppressing it in another by caging it within the confines of Oedipus and the capitalist axiomatic. In this sense, Deleuze and Guattari subordinate the Marxian critique of capital as exploitation and domination to a critique which could be called ontological. Capital is a false movement insofar as it represents production as anti-production. Capital deploys monetary decoding as a qualitative equivalence to stave off the decoded, i.e. the real, as qualitative non-equivalence. And this is why Deleuze and Guattari describe capital as the negative of all social formations. Quote, it is the thing, the unnameable, the generalized decoding of flows that reveals a contrario, the secret of all these formations, coding the flows and even overcoding them rather than let anything escape coding. It cannot be said that the previous formations did not foresee this thing that only came from without by rising from within, and that at all costs had to be prevented from rising. Now, the thing that comes from without while rising from within the socius is capital as generalized decoding of flows. But because it rises from within, say Deleuze and Guattari, quote, it cannot be said that the previous formations did not foresee this. This is their formulation. This is a remarkable admission. In what sense, then, is capital's emergence and the great accidents and what Deleuze and Guattari call the great accidents and amazing encounters punctuating their universal history, which culminates with capital, contingent? Capital itself arises from what Deleuze and Guattari describe as the encounter between private property and commodity production, which presents itself, however, as two quite distinct forms of decoding by privatization and by abstraction, respectively. But what Deleuze and Guattari characterize as an encounter between flows is for Marx a violent confrontation between opposing classes. Commodification and privatization are consequences of originary accumulation, which is to say, the forcible separation of the producers from the means of production. Privatization or enclosure and abstraction or commodification are social processes involving class conflict. They are impersonal, but certainly not machinic in Deleuze and Guattari's sense. And yet Deleuze and Guattari's class monism, their insistence that the bourgeoisie is the only class as such, not only makes the ascendance of the bourgeoisie seem like a bloodless coup, it turns them into the privileged agents of decoding. And this comes as a surprising answer to a question that initially appears naive. Who decodes? On the one hand, coding, overcoding, and decoding are unconscious machinic processes, independent of human volition. And yet, on the other, they implicate human agency at the level of social representation. So, how do unconscious processes come to be consciously advanced by social agents? Or how are the social consequences of unconscious syntheses consciously embraced? Deleuze and Guattari characterize the interaction between social suppression and unconscious repression in the following terms. They write, the suppressive social formation delegates its power to an agent of psychic repression, and correlatively, the suppressed desire is as though masked by the faked displaced image or Oedipus to which the repression gives rise. Psychic repression is delegated by the social formation, while the desiring formation is disfigured and displaced by psychic repression. End quote. Social suppression operates through psychic repression or delegation, which disfigures and displaces desiring production. But desire is suppressed through social representation, which, as we've seen, parallels at the molar level the molecular syntheses of the unconscious, filiative disjunction, connective alliance, and conjunctive perversion, paranoia, or schizophrenia at the three, at the three stages for savages, barbarians, and civilized. When contrasting schizoanalysis to psychoanalysis, Deleuze and Guattari distinguish the former's imminent and legitimate use of the unconscious syntheses from the latter's transcendent and illegitimate use. Where imminent connection is partial and non-specific, its transcendent application is global and specific. Where imminent disjunction is inclusive and non-restrictive, its transcendent application is exclusive and restrictive. And where imminent conjunction is nomadic and pre-individual, its transcendent application is sedentary and individual. It is through this transcendent application of synthesis that social representation totalizes, segregates, and individualizes desire. But while the effectuation of this molar representation is social, its logic is molecular. There is an underlying asymmetry in the alleged parallelism of social and desiring production. Although the molecular is implicated in the molar and the molar envelops the molecular, the logic of implication and the forms of envelopment can only be understood from a molecular vantage, which is to say that the molecular stands to the molar as the transcendental to the empirical, or as the conditioned to the conditioned. And this is why the parallelism of desiring and social production is an asymmetrical relation of enveloped to enveloping, or expressed to expressing, in which the syntheses of production are socially enveloped but never socially determined. It thereby follows that it is the development of enveloped intensities that advances the process of decoding. The difference between the true and the false representation of capital's false movement, i.e., its representation of production as anti-production, is not one of adequacy or correspondence, but of inhibiting or disinhibiting the decoding of flows. And this is why the decisive demarcation for Deleuze and Guattari lies within bourgeois representation, between those who axiomatize and those who decode, or between those who remain within their class and those who are moving towards its outside. Yet, although representation can dampen or amplify molecular movement, it cannot transform the syntheses of production. The difference in scale between the molar and the molecular is absolute. Although inseparable, they do not interpenetrate. This asymmetry in the relation of social to desiring production also explains why, although contingent, the conjunctions and encounters that punctuate Deleuze and Guattari's universal history are not evitable in the sense in which empirical occurrences are said to be. Since capital's limit schizophrenia on their account determines the conditions and possibility of universal history, this history is retrospective, contingent, ironic, and critical. But in order not to collapse into capitalist cynicism, the ironic retrospection of capital's emergence must ascend to the second order, disavowing the disavowal of its inevitability. And thus, where a cynic insists that capitalism was always inevitable, Deleuze and Guattari's ironic retort is that it is only retrospectively inevitable. They ontologize history, unveiling its unconscious transcendental dynamisms, the better to dehistoricize their own ontology, whose categories can be used to extract the machinic necessity enveloped in historical accidents. So while Anti Oedipus is full of references to its own historical moment, gleefully transmitting the spirits of its time, roughly from 1968 to 1972, it makes no attempt to reflexively comprehend its historical conjuncture or incorporate it into the formation of its concepts. And yet, if the history of social production is ultimately driven by desiring production, i.e., the three syntheses, which institutes its own social suppression, we can be forgiven for asking, what is contingent in this history? The machinic origin of social suppression? The succession of suppressive sociuses, earth, despot, capital? Is it necessary or contingent that desire desires its own repression? Would there be any history if it didn't? We know that desire is necessarily self-bounding, that it generates its own repression. Given this ontological premise, this is a history in which, although contingent, the advent of capital is inevitable. But this inevitability is an artifact of Deleuze and Guattari's ontology. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there because I've talked for a long time. but I'll just put up my three, the three substitutions which I think, Deleuze and Guattari carry out in Anti Oedipus, and why ultimately they substitute class monism for the separation of bourgeoisie and proletarians. And this monism is once again is a kind of an evasion of contradiction or of negativity. The state then becomes the function of despotic overcoding, which is always to be which is always necessarily suppressive. And the fundamental antagonism that structures the that structures history. It's not the class struggle between capitalists and proletarians, but the ontological schism between coded and decoded flows, or between social machines and desiring machines. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Brassier. I think we're going to move to the response and then to general questions first here in the room and then to you folks here online. Professor Curtis Allen, you can go right ahead.
All right. Well, that's a hard act to follow, obviously. Yeah, I'll just get right to it since I know time is precious here. So first, I just want to convey my sympathies for everyone displaced throughout Lebanon, however meaningless such sentiments might be. After the discussion, if you're willing, Ray, I'm sure many people would be interested to know how they might help. And if you have any information about how people might best support the many, many people suffering from Israel's airstrikes and ground incursion, I'm sure at least I, for one, would be happy to have that info if you have avenues for that. Let me just quickly thank Justin for spearheading this. Obviously, this was his initiative, and it certainly wouldn't have happened without him. So thanks a lot for that. Thanks also to our director at the Theory Center, Josh, for thinking of me for this as well. And of course, thanks, Ray, for, as always, a deep and penetrating talk, given under what are, I'm sure, extremely trying circumstances. Yeah, it's also good to see you present your work at the Theory Center for the first time, and I'm sure I speak for many people when I say that this has felt like a long time coming, maybe for us. Okay. I'm sure there are a lot of people who want to ask questions, so I'll try to keep my contribution brief. First, I just want to say, like, I deeply sympathize with the kind of what I'll call the repulsion towards the ontologization of social relations we might find in Deleuze and Guattari's works, especially in Anti Oedipus, perhaps slightly to a lesser degree in A Thousand Plateaus, but nonetheless something that runs, I think, through their work from beginning to end, more or less. And I think you've outlined very clearly the critical difference between the theories of valorization in Marx and that of Deleuze and Guattari and Anti Oedipus. Just to briefly recap, in Marx, surplus value in capitalism pertains to the difference between the value represented in the payment by the capitalist for labor power and that generated in the use of labor power itself, that is to say, generated in living labor during production. Roughly speaking, this discrepancy is what accounts for exploitation in Marx's Capital. The crux of the difference in Anti Oedipus, as you stated, comes by reformulating surplus value in terms of a disparity or incommensurability internal to capital itself, between credit money and payment money, or between constant and variable capital, such that Deleuze and Guattari claim, this is me quoting you, human exploitation is now subordinated to the machinic surplus value generated by automation, which points to its decentering. That is the decentering of exploitation. Surplus value, Deleuze and Guattari say, quote, cannot be defined by the difference between the value of labor capacity and the value created by labor capacity, but by the incommensurability between two flows of money, end quote. This seems, that is to say, Deleuze and Guattari's account seems to want to account for the discrepancies between the wealth supposedly generated maybe independently of the real economy by financialization on the one hand, in the form of credit money, and what Deleuze and Guattari see as the productive capacities of the means of production itself involved in automation on the other. Since, given that the possibility of a break from capitalism is, in Deleuze and Guattari's view, subsumed by capitalism itself, inasmuch as the limits of capitalism are internalized and deferred, by the utilization of its own periodic crises, this view of capitalism is incompatible with Marx's, quote, this is you again, wholly unironic belief in the possibility of human freedom beyond capital, end quote. So, given everything we've just heard, I guess I'd first just like you to, or invite you to discuss how you're thinking about Deleuze and Guattari, or about your concept of speculative leftism, which you didn't get to in the talk, but is part of the paper that I read. How these might be situated within the larger aims of your book project, of which I understand this paper is a part. And then lastly, I'll just fire off two related questions. The first is, on your view, are Deleuze and Guattari's politics doomed by their fundamentally anti-humanist and, as you sort of point out in the conclusion here, fundamentally anti-social commitments at the level of the economic base, insofar as desiring production is not determined by social production in any meaningful way? And if that's the truth, if that's how we ought to read Deleuze and Guattari here, why ought we continue to read and critique them? Are there insights in their understanding of capitalism, as they pointed out, in terms of the surplus value flow, or if any other measures they hold? Are there insights there that we would want to hold on to? Secondly, sort of related to that, if we're going to reject this view, which I think, whether or not it works on its own terms, I think it's attempting to grapple with transformations in the economy, especially the financial economy, since Marx was writing in the 1860s and 70s. Anyway, so is it your view that Marx's theory of the relation between surplus value and class struggle, in its sort of classical formulation, is politically capacious enough to deal with the transformations in relations of production of current capital? I'm thinking here of things, of course, like the financialization of the economy, the intensification of automation, as well as the atomization of the worker via new modes of organization of corporate employment and leisure. That is to say, the occasionalization of work, the increasing lumpenization of the proletariat, the statistical and computational capture of attention by social technologies of control, the emergence of a so-called rentier class retarding reinvestment in industrial capital, the breakdown of internationalist socialist movements, which obviously Deleuze and Guattari were kind of responding to in one way or another. Do these present us with new problems for the politicization and organization of a workers' movement? Are these problems confined to transformations in the so-called imperial core, that is to say, to North America and Europe? Are they simply reiterations of old problems under new conditions? I realize that these questions are far too broad for our format here to be answered adequately, but the evaluation of your delineation of these fundamental incompatibilities at the theoretical level of a critique of political economy will ultimately hinge, I think, on motivating considerations like these at the level of practice. Thanks again for a wonderful talk, Ray.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Curtis. Thank you for your comments and questions. First of all, you first asked about how this discussion of Deleuze and Guattari relates to the book of which it's a part. Yeah, so this is an extract from the longest chapter in the book, which is devoted to Anti Oedipus, and it's crucial. The book examines the conditions under which capital presents itself as fate. in which capital has commandeered human destiny, so that it seems that, there is no, possibility of understanding human existence. There are no human possibilities beyond capital, or whatever lies beyond capital would be like just universal death, and some kind of the some horror and atrocity. So that's what the book is about, and it examines various thinkers. It examines thinkers, philosophers who I think um, you know generate very kind of inventive and acute philosophical responses to Marx. Adorno is a key figure because I think he, in his work, this fatality, capital's self-presentation as second nature and as as a kind of as an amplified, ineluctable, challenging of nature's power over us is very kind of powerfully formulated. Um, but in a way, so what I'm most critical of in Deleuze and Guattari's account is that this is a metaphysics of capital. Okay, it's a straightforward, and their whole account follows from, in a way, every socius. Okay, and socius is just a kind of the Latin term they use for social organization, system of social relations. Every socius is, in a way, organized around the suppression of decoded flows, okay, so that they identify this, uncoded surplus or excess as the imminent threat to every social formation. Okay, so the logic of every kind of social formation can be understood in terms of warding off this, the menace of decoded flows. But the ingenuity of their account, it shows how coding generates a decoded surplus. Coding always leaves something out. The very operation of coding generates, an uncoded surplus, which then has to be kind of, recoded and ultimately overcoded through the state, through the emergence of the state. And capital, what they laud in capital is it's a decoding power. The fact that it kind of it undermines, it dismantles the despotic machinery of the state, and releases, um, you know, generates a kind of a generalized decoding of flows. But capital also has to kind of find a way of containing or preventing the catastrophic, the fusion of flows that would simply liquidate, social structure altogether. Okay, and the axiomatic is there to. That's what the axiomatic is there to allow the flux and reflux of credit and debt to kind of always kind of intensify, without these flows fusing, because their fusion would be the meltdown of kind of human civilization. Um, so now, so I'm critical of their. The problem for me is that the horizon of, the fundamental antagonism is between coding and decoding, and the practices of, the class struggle becomes irrelevant. The struggle is between those who still identify in terms of class and those who kind of are, who want to kind of, move outside, penetrate to the outside of class and kind of facilitate this process of decoding. But then the question becomes of what differentiates, one form of decoding, emancipatory decoding, from repressive decoding. Okay. And I've noticed seems to me is the limit, is the kind of, the limitation of kind of Deleuzian politics, is that this is the bottom line, is how to adjudicate The difference between, positive emancipatory decoding and the decoding that simply, intensifies capital's kind of, you know, constant kind of, accumulation and kind of expansion. And I think that the contrast between micro and macro politics, the micro politics is first introduced in the context of Anti Oedipus, and I think that the problem is that every micro political strategy that might be interested in kind of decoding desire always has macro social consequences, and it's always kind of enveloped in a kind of a macrological context. Okay, and I think that there's I think there's the rejection of class struggle and of class consciousness as the kind of as the guiding thread or as the kind of as the bottom line for for emancipatory struggle is leads to all sorts of kind of unhelpful cul-de-sacs. Okay. Um, and there's also a problem that's, as the point of the paper about the link between representation is that the adjudication of the difference between emancipatory and suppressive decoding is adjudicated at a level of consciousness. Okay, is that you need to kind of there's a in a way they kind of they um, these questions about there's a question of in a way the question of interpretation is reintroduced in this account that wants to kind of get rid of, that sees, signification and subjectification as, as Oedipal kind of, straitjackets. So I think because their account rejects kind of dialectics and kind of, the dialectical, the interpenetration of opposites and of contradictories, it means that there's always a kind of a switchback or a flipping from between coding and decoding or deterritorialization and reterritorialization, which is always which can only really be pragmatically adjudicated. And I've noticed that the Deleuzian stress on pragmatics, on machinic pragmatism, does often lead to a kind of something that looks like individualism in all but name, not to put too fine a point on it. Okay, so they disavow individualism and subjectification and facialization, and yet it's quite striking how much these questions are always adjudicated from within a kind of an individuated, you know, um, you know, subjectified kind of vantage point. So I think that the details of their account are dazzling, and like philosophically, it's hard not to be kind of dazzled by the brilliance and the ingenuity of the account. But we should all remember that this account is like 53 or 54 years old. This is no longer, and I think the fact that Deleuze and Guattari did not, deliberately do not, although the book is full of the spirit of its time, but it doesn't historicize or contextualize its own conceptual innovations, um, because that would be to kind of succumb to the kind of the macrological reinscription of, molecular processes. And that's precisely what has dated it. Okay. It's precisely its refusal to historicize its own conditions of conceptual production that that marks it, that makes it a kind of an artifact of its time, a dazzling, a dazzling piece of conceptual machinery, but I think one whose relevant, whose critical purchase on our present is very kind of limited, I think. So yeah, so like you asked, is there anything to kind of to hold on to? Well, I mean, um, as Isabelle Garot points out, I mean, I think she has a very acute kind of analysis of it's a rejection of the the official the communism of the French Communist Party, authoritarian kind of Stalinism, and authoritarian strands in Maoism. But because it never kind of explicitly engages with these, it doesn't try to kind of come up with a Marxian diagnosis of these authoritarian pathologies. It proposes instead this molecular alternative, which ultimately becomes an aesthetic which becomes an aesthetic kind of recoding of of emancipatory politics. And that I think that's an understanding that I think is important to understand why it's not as if this book hasn't been influential. It's been enormously influential. But what, you know, Deleuze himself took admirable political stances, especially concerning Palestine, and I have the highest regard for his courage concerning Palestine. But if you apply the macro micro lens to Palestine, it's disastrous. Okay, if you kind of describe the kind of the Palestinian kind of struggle in molecular terms, and you say the state is like, what are these Palestinians struggling for? And Deleuze says, well, they want a state like any other. And what's remarkable about Deleuze's kind of, embrace of Palestinian liberation is that it's admirable, but it seems to run completely contrary to his own ontologization of politics, so his own conception of molecular politics. It just doesn't work if you apply this kind of optic to a situation like that. So I think I think understanding that is salutary. Okay. Um, your second question was about Marx and the relation between surplus value and class struggle. Is it politically capacious enough to deal with the transformation in the relations of production of current capital, e.g., the financialization of the economy, the intensification of automation, atomization of the worker? Yes, the short answer is yes. I think it is conceptually and politically capacious to do so. And I'm struck by the fact that, there are all sorts of Marxists working on who have, been working, tirelessly certainly for the past kind of 25 years to do just this, to show how, Marx's analytical categories are still indispensable for understanding the present, what has been happening over the past 50 years. I've engaged with some people who I think, communization theorists who I think have a very kind of, acute analysis of what has changed, in terms of the relationship between formal subsumption and real subsumption, how that changes the dynamic of class composition and class struggle. It seems, what's there in Marx and what has been kind of stressed by these kind of theorists is the distinction between the proletariat and the working class. Okay. Um, the critique of, in Deleuze and Guattari, and with many of this, there's a critique of a kind of a sclerotic, authoritarian, socially conservative kind of workerism, where working class identity becomes something to affirm, and it becomes, very often very kind of, repressive and reactionary and chauvinistic and all sorts of, both nationally and racially and sexually. Um, but the Marx's definition of proletarian is simply, to me, the proletariat is the substratum of the working class. Okay, and to be a proletarian is simply to be a bearer of labor power. And Marx's whole point is that as capital proceeds, the whole trajectory of capital development is towards increasing immiseration and the expulsion of more and more workers from the production process, so that proletarianization is the production of unemployment. Okay, so there are more and more proletarians, people who need to sell their labor power in order to exist in a capitalist society, but cannot do so, are now definitively excluded from employment, or in kind of trying to seeking employment in increasingly desperate and precarious conditions. And that is seems to me that is something we see everywhere around us, and that is something predicted by Marx. It's something that Marx's account clearly predicts, which is why what's become apparent now is the kind of the unfortunate conflation between the working class and the proletariat, in a way that the working class is only ever kind of a subset of the proletariat, because most proletarians are unemployed, um, and more are becoming unemployable. So then class struggle is no longer simply about, kind of can no longer simply be understood as confined to the workplace, or it can no longer simply be centered on the wage relation, or rather struggles about struggles over the wage relation, which are absolutely kind of, indispensable, have to be connected to wider struggles about immiseration, unemployment, exploitation, domination, the racialization of populations from the global south as they are forcibly kind of displaced and forced to enter into kind of the global north labor market. So all these things. So I think that there are all sorts of people doing this, all sorts of people showing how Marx's, analytic machinery is sufficiently capacious, is not only actually is more illuminating in terms of understanding our present than these alternative accounts. Um, um, so that's why I think, and you also ask, are these problems confined to transformation in the so-called imperial core? No, because now what has changed now is that, and here I think that, with globalization, or so-called globalization, is it's now the entire Earth is kind of, subsumed or kind of integrated into the kind of the circuits of, capital production. There's no outside, there's no exteriority, but that's not to be understood as some kind of, suffocating kind of enclosure. It simply means that, there's no secession from the capital relation. Okay, there's no unilateral kind of exit from the capital relation once it's understood that it kind of encompasses the entire earth. And that's why it's the class struggle has to be understood now globally in terms of the relationship between the imperial core, or the global north, and the global south, which is now increasingly the kind of the location for manufacturing and production, where the forms of immediate exploitation of labor power that used to be confined to Europe and North America are now kind of, have been transplanted to Asia and Africa, and elsewhere. Um, I think what we have is a kind of all sorts of different dynamism. What has to be avoided is a monological um, formulation of Marx's account, or of class struggle. Class struggles unfolds in different dimensions and different registers. It's all, in some contexts, it's a struggle over the wage relation and the condition and working conditions. But in other contexts, it's about land. It's about, it's about the defending land from privatization and enclosure. And in other contexts, it's about information. It's about the kind of resisting the commodification of information through kind of, AI, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's unfolding. I think that our conception of class struggle has to be vastly, once you understand how capacious Marx's conception of class struggle is, precisely because it's not simply about it was never about kind of, factories or workshops exclusively. Then you see how, all these different struggles over wages, struggles over land and privatization, and struggles over the commodification of information, how they're all interconnected. So, and I
Yeah,
think,
that's really
and
great.
people are working on this. I think people are
Mhm.
actually, this is what people are currently doing. So, um, yeah,
Yeah. Ray, I just want to leave time for everyone else, but thank you so much. Yeah, thanks a lot.
thank you,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, I also just wanted to check in to see, Ray, how long you want to go on for. I know it's probably late for you, how much time you would like to sort of devote to questions so that we could limit it. It's about 1:50 our time. We were going to end around 2 beforehand. I was wondering if you wanted to just cut it off at 10 minutes or go a little bit over that time. It's really the ball's in your court.
I I think I can go for maybe another 20 minutes if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So how about we start with just one question in the room here, and then we can go back online, and perhaps Josh can choose a question from the online chat. Does anybody in here have any pressing questions or anything they wanted to ask? Or can we just move it to online? Yeah, Fernando.
Um, Hello, thanks for the really great talk. I have two quick questions. The first one is the first one is kind of selfish, so feel free to not respond it. But is there like a relation between the methodological understandings of the blues and the logics of cybernetics, especially this second order cybernetics that it's more managerial, So it kind of like the decoding flows, the logic of second order cybernetics, as I understanding, is what the Deleuze calls the decoding flows, or this excess, to reintegrate them into this, what you call the capital credit money and payment money, So for example, that would be one of the logics of Stafford beer in Chile, And it was applied there. So I don't know, but it's really selfish for my for my research, so feel free to not answer it. And the second one, it was more political. Maybe you already answered it a little, which was through this logic of the loose, the flux of that, the credit, the relation between credit money and payment money, and especially the processes of decoding and coding. How do we understand the processes of industrialization of a lot of countries, especially in the, as you said, in the global south, or third world? Could we understand them just like an access to the flows of decoding, or would there be another like thing there?
Okay, thank you. I'll try and order. Well, yeah, Deleuze and Guattari they do engage. There is a kind of a connection between certainly, their work in Anti Oedipus and, cybernetics. And I think they have a couple of things to say about it. Um, However, they're also critical, um, because so how can I put this? Yeah, they're very critical of the notion of proper function. Okay, so they think that a system is simply what it does, and that there is no kind of point kind of distinguishing between, what a system does and what it ought to do. Okay. So in that way, they're critical of, so this is a hylozoic kind of account where matter organizes itself. Okay. But on their accounts, precisely because they think that's, organic unity, is always a kind of an overcoding of these of molecular dynamisms. Okay, so that they're critical of the primacy of the organism. And that means that they're very critical of a kind of Aristotelianism, which thinks that organisms are self-organizing wholes and self-maintaining wholes. And they think that I mean, I don't know enough about the historical debates about, but there is a kind of a conservative strand in cybernetics, which I guess kind of would kind of privilege self-maintenance at the expense of self-transformation, and they're much more interested in how an analysis of the parts can kind of help us understand how wholes the inhibitory status of wholes or of totalities, both in nature and in social organizations. Second order, you mentioned second order cybernetics. I'm not. Can you remind me of what that means? Because I know that Baudrillard mentions this in in his work on symbolic exchange, but I've forgotten what it means. So if you can remind me of what it means. Um,
Oh, it's like they use especially like the logic of the feedback loops, no, in order to
mhm.
create like the self-sustaining system can absorb like the feedback of the ambience, no, in order to regulate itself and make decisions out of not just the internal system but also out the outside system.
Yes. Well, very simply, the whole, Deleuze and Guattari's whole impetus is about kind of finding this kind of sweet spot between organization and disorganization. They think that, kind of the cutting edge, what they're after, and especially becomes evident in A Thousand Plateaus, is, how stratification is all about organization. It involves kind of the suppression, the suppression and inhibition of unstable or destructive kind of dynamics. But for them, what they seek in their work is to find the point at which disorganization, to find the kind of the a balance between organization and disorganization, the point at which disorganization or disorder or chaos generates transformation, because that's what they're really interested in, transformation, so that it's not self-maintenance or self-perpetuation that they're interested in, but kind of creative self-transformation, whereby the inside and the outside are kind of you know productively kind of interconnected. So that's it. So that, yeah, that there's a clear link. And a lot of their work is about this, what they call kind of becoming. Becoming is all about this kind of something that happens, you know, um, in between kind of a kind of a stable structure and an unstable kind of dynamism. Um, so yeah, there's a that's a constant kind of thread throughout their work. And then you asked about industrialization and the link between industrialization and decoding. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, because I mean, you mentioned that the logics of finance capital, it's kind of also like the decoding of flows, no? So,
Yes.
and this relation between the coding of flows and the decoding of flows kind of also follow the logics of capital. So I'm also thinking about the logic of capital and the difference between industrialization and financialization. Or you cannot have financialization without industrialization. So if industrialization follows the coding of flow and industrial and financialization follows the logic of the flows of decoding, sorry. How do we, like in politics, how would we understand the processes of countries when they develop their nation projects, as especially processes of industrialization? You know, would it be still like in a way of trying to access this processes of this decoding flows, or is there like another logic there?
Well, that's a very, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer. I mean, what, in a way, I think that now merchants' capital, industrial capital, financial capital, they all coexist. They're all kind of, there's never, a single form of capital. Capital exists, under different conditions and different kind of circumstances, and different forms of capital productively interact. Merchants' capital, industrial capital, and finance capital. And now, in our contemporary conjuncture, all three forms. So you have deindustrialization in some economies, in the first world, but also industrialization in Asia in particular. And the thing is not to separate them or to treat them as antithetical. So once you understand that, Marx is often misread as offering a kind of a stagist or teleological account where you move, from kind of manufacture to kind of industrial production. I think that happened in England, but that's just a kind of a single case, and it's not, um, it's not, you know, an indispensable or kind of a necessary component for the functioning of capital. Um, and look, financialization is, well, what's the link between, I mean, financialization involves kind of, decoding in one register. Um, there's been a lot of work to show how much of the contemporary capitalist economy, you know, of the kind of the tranches of contemporary capital, how financial capital dwarfs, industrial capital. Um, but even, the conditions under which um, the conditions under which, industrialization or deindustrialization unfold are tied to this, this single logic of, um, maximizing kind of, surplus value and profit. And I think that, so for instance, in contemporary, some writers have pointed out that it's no longer in the United States and in Europe, it's now circulating capital, which is a primary source of profit as opposed to kind of, manufacturing capital. So that the investment in the distribution or the circulation of commodities, and the exploitation of service work is a kind of a greater kind of source of revenue, of capital revenues and kind of industrial manufacture. But I don't know enough about this because I'm not an economist, so I'm afraid anything I say is going to be half-baked. It's a very good question, but I just don't know enough to answer it, I'm afraid. But I think it's the right question to ask, but I wish I knew enough to answer it properly.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm just keeping an eye on time. I think we may have time for like one more question. So I'll just pick Catherine Everett, who.
Hey, hi. I'll try and keep it brief. Yeah, Ray, thank you so much for this really rich, really excellent talk. In particular, I really love the discussion of the creation ex nihilo under capitalism, this filiative action of capital upon itself, and as well as its sort of incestuous acting upon itself in order to reproduce. So I just wanted to ask, when we're talking about code and coding with Deleuze and Guattari, if we can think about code today in the contemporary sense of coding in the digital age, particularly if we think about coding as like disentangling what is entangled, reentangling code. What I'm specifically thinking about is the really interesting sort of creation ex nihilo of the valuation of data itself. And with this valuation of data and the perpetual creation of data today, especially with algorithms broadly, with AI, that we are creating this value really out of nowhere with data. If we could look to like the sort of framework that you've created with Deleuze and Guattari, look at this problem with them in mind, look at Marx with them in mind. Perhaps there's like a wider chasm between the two with this problem, or perhaps there's a way to like link these two together. Specifically, right, insofar as AI produces its own data and now there's not even, labor involved in this production. And if there is labor involved, it's incredibly obscured, right, in terms of like being outsourced to different countries, et cetera. Very much behind the scenes sort of labor. I mean, it's reminiscent of Marx's, workers that now just labor for the machine, right? That's exactly what we are doing, right? We are laboring for the machine for AI in this way. But just the other connection I wanted to mention in terms of this interesting tension between credit and payment that you're talking about with Deleuze and Guattari. I mean, this has been really kind of well documented today, like in pop like media, in terms of AI investments between different companies, that they have invested in their own startups and these startups are buying their own stock, right? That there's this sort of like vicious circle happening in terms of credit and payments. So like just specifically within this AI bubble that's going on. So yeah, I wonder if we can read this very like contemporary problem in the market with your framework here. And I mean, it seems like it all kind of maps on very well. And perhaps we don't need to like throw Marx out with the bathwater, which I think is what you're proposing as well, right? That we can read these. We can read everyone together, and like you mentioned in just a previous comment, right? Like Marx's capaciousness for understanding labor is far beyond just the factory machine, and perhaps this is a a good example of that. Yeah, and I think anyway, I mean, that's just some obvious thoughts that I think are relevant, contemporary, something I'm working on, but perhaps this sparks something for you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So about first of all, about Deleuze and Guattari's account of coding. Yes, it can certainly be applied to contemporary technological processes, digitization, but the problem with, or it can be applied to anything. Remember, they begin their account of coding talking about kind of, with this anthropological literature, talking about kind of, social, marking, tattooing, how a territory, how a kind of a human kind of population stakes out a territory, its relation to the territory, the set of symbolic practices through which it kind of a tribe or a community institutes both interpersonal relations and relations to the earth. Okay, so that's coding. So in a way, coding, it's an ontological phenomenon for Deleuze and Guattari, and it's not technological. Technological, in a way, that's a much narrower and kind of, I guess, medium specific operation. So you can certainly apply their account, to kind of advanced kind of digital technology, communication technology. But I don't think that much would be, I don't think you'd get much would be illuminated. I think you just re-describe the phenomenon in this kind of language, which I don't think is necessarily illuminating. Once you understand that it's really about processes, it's about ways of connecting, disconnecting, reconnecting, kind of connecting, disjoining, conjoining. That's it's all happening at that level. But I do think that but I take your point about the significance of credit and payment. And in a way, what this, I mean, I'm very indebted to kind of Christian Kerslake's article, kind of patiently explaining how much Deleuze and Guattari rely on Suzanne de Brunnhoff and Bernard Schmitt. I mean, he really patiently explicates how everything they're saying, which is quite baffling when you read it, it's quite obscure and hard to understand. But then if it's explained through that, then everything it's much simpler. It's kind of really clear. But I think it's clear that, Suzanne de Brunnhoff is like the crucial thinker and the unduly neglected thinker, because she's the one who insists that we can acknowledge the relative Ottomanization of flows of credits and debt, and how they become increasingly they're no longer directly tethered to labor, to productive labor. But for her, that doesn't mean that kind of money can float free of social labor altogether. So she thinks that what's happened is that, you know, the circuits that tie social labor to credit money and payment money have become much more complicated and kind of indirect and circuitous. But nevertheless, they're still, that doesn't mean that, there's no link. Okay. So she insists, I mean, the great merit of her work, it seems to me, is to insist that you can understand all this stuff, but you still need Marx to understand what money and what the kind of the generation of money and the generation of money through credits and payments on credits, etc., is still kind of embedded in the class relation, and it always it has some kind of you know you cannot simply abstract it from the wage relation completely, and you can't say, as Schmidt says, that ultimately that workers should be grateful to banks for making the money through which they can afford to buy commodities, because that's what Schmidt is saying. He said we should all be grateful to bankers, because without them we wouldn't be able to buy anything. So that's but yes, no, but I think this is so I would encourage. I mean, I don't know the Brunhoff's work, but reading Kerslake's work has really, everyone should go out and read Suzanne de Brunhoff. I think that's that's the kind of the message. Thanks for that.
Okay. I think probably we're at a good time to say thank you again to Ray for joining us and for delivering this outstanding talk, and um, for coming to the Theory Center at a moment where I think we are deeply thankful, and it's a special moment for all of us. I saw people did leave some notes about how to help people in Lebanon in the chat there. So
Actually, I'm also happy to kind of give information about that. I can email information about who to contact. There's all sorts of uh, people basically collecting money, but I'm happy to. I don't have the information, to hand right now, but I'm happy to provide it basically, because it'd be great if people were willing to kind of sending money is the simplest way basically. There's if you're living in Canada or North America, that's the simplest way.
okay, maybe if you send it to myself or to Justin, we can be able to circulate it.
Sure, sure.
Okay. Okay, well, I think we can just say thank you again. I appreciate hugely, I would say the way you patiently explicate and is its own kind of decoding, that is incredibly insightful, and it's something I think we all admire very deeply in your work, right?
Thank you. Thanks, and thanks for inviting me to talk about this. So it's been nice because this is unpublished work, so I'm very happy to be able to discuss it.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I'll thank everybody for coming, and I'll close the Zoom.
Okay, thank you, thanks, bye.
Thanks. Bye.
The recording has stopped.